Well, today on the show, it's a special one. We have an interview with the famous George Gammon, the legend on YouTube, the Mr. Free Market capitalist and macroeconomics expert. And George and I sit down and we chat about money and capitalism and governments and Federal Reserves and all that good stuff, as well as a background on George and how he became a multimillionaire and how he lives a life of freedom. So stay tuned. You're going to enjoy this one.
Welcome to the Unconstrained Podcast, your regular podcast on how to escape the chains of the 21st century, become financially independent, and live a global lifestyle. Now, here's your host, Miles Wakeham.
Welcome to the Unconstrained Podcast. I am your host, Miles Wakeham. This is a show about how to live a life of freedom without the shackles of debt by embracing the art of contrarian thinking. Well, a short introduction to this episode because the interview I have with George Gammon is quite long and I want you to be able to enjoy it. Just a quick shout out again to all of our Patreon supporters. I really enjoy the banter we have going on over there, the discussions I've made and the friends I've made over there with people who are like-minded thinkers and want to live a life of being unconstrained. And I'm really encouraged to see how so many are actually reaching out and trying things that maybe they wouldn't have tried before, whether it might be where they're traveling, how they're investing, what they're thinking about in terms of their future, and where they're kind of managing to sort of shift their thinking towards a life where they are back in control of themselves and being truly unconstrained. It absolutely is rewarding for me to see people who achieve that unconstrained life, because I don't know if enough people are out there telling people that they can do it. So yes, in a world of surveillance and anti-money laundering and all those great government things that they'll tell you about that are in your best interests, I can tell you right now, if you're feeling constrained and you're wondering why the system isn't supporting you, then head over to Patreon and join our community, because that's what we're on about over there. We're talking all about freedom. How you can become free, how you can break the shackles of debt and not fall into the trap that is the social mantra. And I know I go on and on about this because I need to. There's not enough people out there calling these things out for what they are, that we're being fed lies, we're being fed false hope. And when you've got 80% of people who cannot retire at the age of 65, that don't have the capital and that are going to work until the day they die, we as a society have a problem on our hands. And I don't care what flavor of politics you subscribe to. The end of the day is the buck stops on our desk to fix this problem. And we as a community have taken that on, and we are going to do that. So if you're part of the group, head over to Patreon and join us over there. We'd love to have you. So after this short message, my interview with George Gammon, hope you enjoy it.
We have launched an additional broadcast newsletter for our Patreon community called This Week in Freedom. This is a private group where we cover specific investment opportunities, ways to manage risk, and hands-on techniques to thrive and grow wealth in this new age. You can find out more at BeUnconstrained.com/TWIF or join us at BeUnconstrained.com/Patreon.
Well, today on the show, I am blessed to have the celebrity on YouTube, I must say, George Gammon, joining us. George, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here and hopefully give some value to your audience.
I'm sure you will. Appreciate that. So let's get started. For people who haven't encountered you yet or just know a little bit about you, can you give us your background?
Sure. I was an entrepreneur for many years. I retired in 2012 at the ripe old age of 38 years old. And when I retired, I knew nothing about investing. I knew nothing about economics. I didn't know what the Fed was. I barely knew what interest rates were. So I had to learn that stuff pretty quick. I dove in and listened to podcasts and audio books and just kind of went down the rabbit hole. I got really interested in economists like Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell, and investors like Jim Rogers and Peter Schiff, and guys that kind of lean more toward the Austrian school that are favorable toward hard money and gold. That just made a lot of sense to me. So I started investing in real estate in 2012 because I thought it was a good time. I just kind of looking at some charts and doing all this research, I stumbled across a chart going back to 1900 of the U.S. housing market adjusted for inflation and size. And I saw that we were kind of at our historic trend line. It really didn't change much from 1900 to 2000. And then in the early 2000s, of course, you see this chart just go parabolic and then peak out about 2006. And then obviously we know what happened then. And it hits that trend line right about 2012. Now, mind you, back then, everyone thought the real estate market was just continuing to, it's going to continue to go down and down and down and down and down. And that was the very worst place that you could possibly invest. And no one in their right mind would go into real estate right now because don't you know it's a huge crash and real estate's never, ever, ever going to recover and all these things. So I just kind of, listened to Jim Rogers and I said, you just got to buy things when they're cheap and sell them when they're expensive. So I thought, well, maybe this real estate stuff is pretty cheap right now. So I did some more research and looked at Japan going back to 1990 when they had their big crash. And I saw that their real estate market went down by about 60%. And so I thought we were down by 50, maybe I got 10% of downside and I could buy stuff under the cost of construction. The cash flow was really good. So I, like as an entrepreneur, I kind of shot first and ask questions later. That's kind of a theme throughout my life. And I didn't know anything about real estate, but I'm like, you know what? Let's just make it happen. So I went to a tax auction in the first day after, and keep in mind, up to this point in my life, I'd never owned a piece of real estate, ever. I'd always just rented because it was just more flexible and I just didn't want the headache. So I'd never owned a piece of property. And the first day at the tax auction, I bought 6 houses and just said, let's make it happen. So that was how I got into real estate. And then as an entrepreneur, I made quite a bit of money overseas. So once I figured out the real estate game in the United States, I thought, well, maybe I can take my my knowledge or my expertise of doing business overseas and maybe get a higher return, maybe some more margin, maybe better cash flow. And I also had kind of a macro view that a lot of Americans would start retiring in South America because I thought inflation, the cost of goods and services in the United States would go up and they'd be on a fixed income. And I thought that there was quite a discrepancy between the real rate of inflation and the actual inflation numbers that the government tells us that's tied to Social Security payments. So I thought, man, if I'm someone who's 70 years old or so, and, maybe I'm in New York or something like that in one of these high priced areas and all my kids kind of live in another state. Like, why would I not just move to somewhere like Colombia where it's only a 3-hour flight from Miami still. It's on the same time zone as the United States. And with my, let's call it $3,000 a month that I'm getting in maybe benefits or Social Security or retirement, what have you, that my standard of living can increase 10 times above and beyond what it would be here in the United States. So, why not? So anyway, that's kind of the macro thesis there. And then in Colombia, more specifically, in 2015, the oil got down below $30 a barrel. If people remember, oil got real cheap. And so I didn't know how to invest in oil, but I wanted to do so. So I figured, well, the Colombian peso is loosely tied to oil because they're a big oil exporter. And at the time, I knew real estate really well. So I'm like, well, if I buy real estate that's denominated in the local currency, then in a way, that's kind of like going long oil. So, but it's expressing the bet in a way which I was comfortable with because I had expertise in real estate. So that's why I went to Colombia. I started investing there heavily in 2015 and have been doing so to today. In 2019, we did a TV show there where I was doing all of these remodels. I have a team that I still have there that's working on all these projects. And I thought, well, we're doing this stuff and it's just like these TV shows that you see in the United States and they're wildly popular in the States. So why wouldn't they be wildly popular here in Colombia? So I just, again, that's another example of just kind of shooting first and asking questions later. I had no clue how to do a TV show. I mean, I didn't know the first thing about it, but I went down to the local station. I got a meeting with them, and I just pitched them as though this would be the greatest thing ever, and I could make it happen. And, you know, don't worry about it. It's going to be an awesome TV show. And they said, okay, bring us back a 5-minute clip of what your vision is in 2 weeks. And then we'll take it to the executives, and then we'll kind of let you know what we're thinking. So that in 2 weeks, I had to not only figure out how to produce a TV show, but I also had to create a 5-minute kind of demo reel, if you will, for the network. And so I went out there and I hired some editors and some videographers, and I just studied, you know, reality TV to try to figure out how they did it to keep people's attention and how they cut. It's actually quite technical. And we had this demo reel. We went back to the station 2 weeks later, and the executives were actually there in the meeting. So it was unexpected. So we showed this demo reel, and they were supposed to wait another 2 weeks and kind of think about it. But as soon as they saw the demo reel, they're like, okay, we don't need this anymore. This is done. Let's put it on there. This is fantastic. So we did a season of that and 13 episodes, and that went really well. It was a lot of fun. Then we were kind of in a hiatus between season 1 and 2, and I wanted to keep these people working because they were wildly talented, my editors and videographers and my whole team. And so we started the YouTube channel, and initially it was about real estate investing, and I really like talking about macro. That's kind of my passion. So I started doing some videos on that, and oddly enough, the videos on macro were extremely popular. Videos on real estate, not so much. So we just kept doing more of the macro stuff, and that was about a year ago, or a little over a year ago, and now the YouTube channel has 175,000 subscribers and gets between 1.2 million and 1.5 million views a month.
Wow, that's a rise. That's a rapid rise, that's for sure. So let me go back a little bit in that story. You mentioned that you retired at 37. How did that come about? How did you get to that point?
Well, right out of college, I started a T-shirt company. I mean, I almost flunked out of high school, and I mean, my grades were atrocious. And the only reason I got into a college is just on an athletic scholarship. So, but even in college, I mean, my grades weren't very good. I just barely got by. It's always very boring to me, and it just it couldn't keep my attention. I just thought it was nonsense. So, and I thought it was kind of a waste of time. So anyway, when I got out of college, the first thing I did is start a T-shirt business. Now, mind you, I never really sat down and said, and kind of looked in the mirror and said, okay, what do you want to do with your life? Well, I'm going to be an entrepreneur. Like, I think a lot of kids today kind of have that view because of what they see online, which is fantastic. But back then, this was maybe, late, like 99, something like that, 98, 2000. There wasn't, you couldn't find this stuff on YouTube or, or on podcasts or anything like that. So I never had just look in the mirror and say, okay, you're going to be an entrepreneur. I'm just like, well, okay, I'm out of college. What do I want to do? Well, let's start a T-shirt company. That sounds like fun, and I'd enjoy it. So I started working valet at the Golden Nugget because I could work. I was in Vegas at the time. Mm-hmm. And I could work graveyards. So I was working 10 at night to 8 in the morning, and I could take my tip money and invest it in the T-shirt business. And I could work on my T-shirt business from like 9 o'clock in the morning to maybe, what I do, like 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And then I'd sleep for a little bit and go back to work. And that was how I got into it. And that, of course, the T-shirt business failed miserably. And then I just kept doing it. And I got a couple jobs in between. And the one job that I have was only paying, and keep in mind, this wasn't in the 1950s. This was like in 2000 or so. But I was making like $400 a month, or excuse me, $400 a week. And with this job, and I remember my parents and my whole family, for that matter, was really almost mad at me for working that job because I couldn't afford rent. I could barely afford food. And I mean, I was just scrambling to get by. The reason I took the gig, though, is because I knew that if I could learn that, that I would be very successful because I saw the people running the business and they're very kind and very nice. And I saw that they were making a decent amount of money. And I thought, boy, I could do this a lot better. And so all I need to do is I'm going to work for free, basically, because I'm going to figure out this business, because I know that once I figure it out, that I can leverage it and make a ton of money doing this. So I did that. And then the next thing, I did well in that business, and they wanted me to kind of manage a couple locations. And then I started a consulting business that was based on advertising and running radio. And it was kind of a media buying company, and that I just kind of stumbled into, because going back to the businesses that I was kind of managing there, the whole national chain had an ad agency that they would use, and I always hated them. I always thought they were garbage. And I said, listen, these people, for lack of a better word, these people suck. I mean, they're terrible. And they're writing all our radio copy and placing all the ads. And again, I didn't know anything about it, but I'm like, I could do a hell of a lot better than this. And so I remember it was maybe 2002 or something like that, but I convinced the person that actually owned the operation that I was managing. I said, listen, just let me, just this week, because all call to action advertising. So it's all direct response. So you could see how well the ad did just by how many calls you got on the phone. So I said, listen, let me write the radio copy this week. And if it doesn't work, well, then fine. We'll continue to use XYZ ad agency. But if it works, which I can promise you it will, because I know I can do better. And then so we did it. And sure enough, it worked well. And then it worked really well. And then it worked really, really, really well as far as the numbers. And then everyone started to see, because it was a national chain, started to see how well we were doing. And everyone said it's because George is writing the radio copy and George is doing all the ad work and he took that away from XYZ companies. So then everyone wanted to hire me to do their ad work and their media buying. So that's kind of how the consulting thing came about. And in between that time, from there on, I started doing that. I took on a lot of clients, and then I took some businesses over from bankruptcy, where I won't go into great detail, but we were offered a few that they just said, here's the keys, take it, assume the liabilities, and we'll just give you the business. And we said, okay. So we go in, and I'd take the business over, and I'd spend about a year on it, or a year and a half. We'd get it up profitable, then we try to flip it. Mm-hmm. Very similar to what I did with real estate in 2012. It's pretty much the same stuff. So you just go in there, you buy an undervalued asset that no one wants, and you improve it, and you remodel it, if you will, and then you sell it to someone once you've added the value, and you pocket the spread. So then in, I think it was 2007 or something like that. No, actually earlier than that. But then I had done a few businesses then, and I'm like, okay, now it's time to really take some risk. So I took all my life savings, and I borrowed a bunch of money at just an exorbitant rate of it. I mean, a ridiculous interest rate. And I don't even know if you want to call it an interest rate. It was so over the top. But again, I just, and everyone thought, man, you're taking on so much risk. Why would you do that? And to me, it wasn't risky at all, because I'm like, listen, this is going to be a huge success, and I'm going to be able to pay this guy back easy. So if I can pay him back and then I get the business, why not pull the trigger? This is a no-brainer. So I did that, and that was very successful. And then in 2009, I started another business. That was the last one that I retired from. But I think that my main point here, I'm kind of going off on a tangent, is that in 2012, the business we had then had over 100 employees when you include the part-time. It was doing about 24 million in annual revenues. And I'd grown it from scratch, just as an idea on my legal pad a few years earlier. And I was flying actually to Australia. In fact, I was doing business there, and it was that flight from LA to Brisbane, that 14-hour flight. I'm sure you've taken a few times.
Oh, it's a doozy.
Yeah. And I just came to the realization that the whole reason I wanted to make money in the first place was to have more freedom, because I was dirt poor growing up. And in college, of course, you don't have two nickels to rub together. And that's no fun. So you're like, okay, well, if I make some money, at least I can have the flexibility and the freedom to maybe buy some things or travel or just kind of live life on my own terms. And I realized on that flight that I had built this monster that I had become a slave to. Mm-hmm. And although I was making all this money, I had less freedom than I did back in college when I was eating top ramen and didn't have a quarter to my name. So I thought, okay, well, this doesn't make any sense. I'm just a gerbil in a wheel here, or hamster wheel. So I said, I'm going to take some time off and just kind of reevaluate. And fortunately, I had a couple of partners who were fine running the business. And I took about 3 months off, and then I just said, you know what, guys, here's the keys. You can have the business. I started it, and I just gave it to them, and it was done. I hung it up, and then that's when I got into real estate and told the story that I told earlier.
Wow, that's a great story. I mean, it's the path of the true entrepreneur. I mean, the real entrepreneur, not the stuff they teach in college. And I think that in some ways it kind of, I mean, I can relate to this story directly. I think that what I'm finding with a lot of my audience is that they found themselves in a situation where they didn't maybe they followed your path up to a point, up to possibly the end of college. But at that point, there was a difference in some people are just born to do what you do, and other people are not. They're born to work for somebody. And that's okay. I mean, we're a wonderfully diverse culture, and thank God we are, because it keeps life interesting. But for those people that, a lot of people on my show, listen to my show, they came out of that 2012 period, but rather than doing what you did, in fact, what I did as well, which is buy a lot of distressed real estate and refurbish it, what they did was they continued work, putting their money away in their 401ks or their IRAs or whatever the popular mode of equity investment was, and then watching this kind of stock market bull hit the tarmac and go. And right. A lot of them have come out of that with this kind of blind faith in equities and this blind faith in investing in somebody else's business, being entirely detached from the actual mechanics of what's going on. And I do find constantly that I'm having to justify a sense of it's better for you to have control over what you're doing than it is to give that to a counterparty.
Yeah.
So with that said, what I would like to address, and this is kind of going to be a running theme that I'm going to do on a few different episodes here, but I'm going to throw a hypothetical at you and say that if you had $1 million given to you, where in 2020, where would you put that money? And I don't want you to be specific, I mean, because obviously I don't want you to tell people about these great investments that are out there. But from a general point of view, knowing what you know about the world and about the economy and your experience, what do you think, where do you think that money should go?
Well, regardless of how much money someone has or how much money I have, I just kind of look at a portfolio in three buckets. And this has served me well with this strategy, and then overlaying kind of a mentality where you want to buy things when they're cheap and you want to sell them when they're expensive. So if you want to remind me, we'll get into that in a moment. But as far as the portfolio construction, I just like to do a 10-80-10. So 10% would be you've got to have some insurance, because the central banks, we all know, they're printing a ridiculous amount of money. I won't go into the nitty gritty and the esoteric language and whatnot, but the bottom line is they're creating more currency units that at some point in time, most likely, will be chasing the same amount of goods or services, or a less amount, a fewer goods and services in the real economy, which would create consumer price inflation. So the stuff you buy, I'm sure many of your listeners, if they're in the United States, they've seen their grocery bill go up substantially in the last few months. And that's exactly what I'm referring to. So you want something to hopefully maintain your purchasing power and to hedge against that type of central bank activity. the additional currency units. So that's why I like gold for that. And then with the 80% of the portfolio, I like to find stuff that pays me to own it. And that's how I define an investment. And so Bitcoin, to me, as an example, is not an investment. And that's just the way I define it. I think it's great speculation. Get to that in a moment. But it doesn't pay me to own it. And the reason I'm so adamant about that part of the portfolio is because since 2012, I've been very fortunate where I've made a lot of money with my investments, but I have made some mistakes. And every single time I've got my butt handed to me in an investment, it's number one, because I didn't buy it when it was super cheap. And number two is because I bought something that was illiquid that didn't pay me to own it. And even if I would have made the other mistakes, if I would have bought like a piece of real estate, these were properties like land, right? If they were at least just a finished like single family home and I couldn't sell it, or it was rather illiquid, I wouldn't have to lower my price to fire sell it and take a big hit if I was making a couple grand a month on the positive cash flow, right? So that's why I now am really, I'm really adamant about having a large portion of your portfolio that you don't have to sell. You know, another thing, quick story, is I helped my sister sell a vineyard in Paso Robles in Los Angeles. She had a 100-acre vineyard out there. And in the process, it was a little tight because cash flow was in that business it can fluctuate substantially. And she was at a time when the cash flow wasn't booming, to say the least, and it put her in a position to where she had to sell. And you know, you're sitting there negotiating with a buyer, and you don't want to let them know that you got to sell, but you don't have much leverage in that situation. So if you've got this cash flow coming in, again, using the example of just a rental property, you don't have to sell that thing. Mm-hmm. And then you've got all the leverage. So if you want to sell it and some buyer gives you an offer and you want to tell them to pound sand, you can tell them to pound sand. You don't need to unload it because you've got this negative carry. Like let's use property in LA right now, where, you know, people are taking out these mortgages, but the rental yield or the rental cash flow isn't paying the mortgage and all the expenses. So you're, let's say, taking $2,000 a month out of pocket. You have to pay $2,000 a month to hold the property. Well, now, especially if prices start to go down to where you're losing equity and you've got to fire sell the thing, you're going to take a huge haircut because you've got to take any price or anyone that's willing to take the property off your hands. So I never, ever, ever wanted to be in that position. That's another reason why I like the 80% that pays you on it. But you've got to buy things when they're cheap, sell them when they're expensive. It sounds crazy, but the best investments I've made are when I tell my friends and family about them and they look at you like you're absolutely crazy. They say, "What are you doing? That is the stupidest idea I have ever heard. You're going to lose all your money. That's a terrible investment." I mean, Colombia was a great example of that. You know, not only was I going to lose all my money, but I was going to get killed. I was going to get beheaded. I was going to get kidnapped. I was going to get the only person that goes to Colombia deals drugs and all these crazy things. And those are always the investments where you make all the money. The investments where I lost money, I was talking about the illiquid land deals, were the ones that you tell your friends and family about. And they're like, "Oh, well, yeah, that's a great idea. George, yeah, how can I get in on that investment?" You know that when you start hearing that, that should be a red flag. Your spidey senses should go on right there and say, "Wait a minute, do I really want to, maybe I'm not thinking this through." So that's kind of some little things that I use. And then the other 10%, I would categorize as speculation. So there, I'm just looking for something that I think has asymmetry, meaning very little downside and a lot of upside, or at least relatively speaking. So I would throw Bitcoin into that bucket. I would throw like the gold miners into that bucket. I would throw commodities right now, like uranium, very, very cheap. And commodities are not only cheap, but they're an all-time low going back 120 years when you compare them to financial assets. So But of course, a lot of them don't pay you to own it, or if you might be able to find a producer that does. But so that's kind of how I lay things out, regardless of whether it's 100 grand, a million, 10 million, 100 million. That's kind of how I like to do it.
So summary, 10% in insurance-based assets like precious metals,
Yeah.
gold,
Yeah.
80% real estate, 10%.
Well, not necessarily real estate.
Okay.
Because you can get some dividend-paying stocks. In fact, I just spoke with someone last night who has an investment fund where he goes into some countries in Africa, and he's buying beverage companies right now, more specifically beer companies, in these countries that are paying a 10, 12, 13% dividend yield that have pretty darn stable currencies relative to the dollar, because that's typically your risk right there. So that would be an example of another asset that you could buy if you're not a real estate type of person that pays you to own it.
So the interesting thing I'm hearing in your story is the references to non-US based investments, real estate that's in Colombia, for example. How did you stumble upon that? Did you find it just in travels, or what made you want to leave the United States with your money? I'm not saying from a permanent standpoint, but from an investment standpoint. Why was that more important to you?
Well, initially because I made a lot of money overseas. So I was very comfortable. It was kind of natural for me once I started doing things and making money in the US to say, I wonder if I can make more money in Australia, or I wonder if I can make more money in Colombia or South America or something like that. And then I looked at kind of this macro approach that I'd been studying since 2012. And that we talked about oil, and I wanted to go long oil, but that was kind of a macro view. And then you just try to figure out, okay, how can I express the bet from a bottoms up way in something that I actually know about and where I have expertise. So that was kind of the mindset. I don't know that it was specifically trying to get outside the United States, but more so just trying to find the best opportunity possible. Mm-hmm. And just trying to maximize my returns. Now, I'm area agnostic. I mean, if I felt as though there was something cheap right now in the United States that was better than anything else out there, trust me, I'd be buying it. But right now and back then, I didn't think there was the opportunity in the United States that there was outside. And so keep in mind, this was between 2012, 2015, I was in the U.S. doing this. But then in 2014, 15, I started going to the tax auctions, and I started seeing the prices getting bid up. And all of a sudden, I'm not buying stuff for under the cost of construction. All these guys are paying over the cost of construction. I'm like, wait a minute here. Okay. It's not like super expensive yet, but it's just not super cheap. So then that's kind of what prompted me to look elsewhere. Also, too, I've always, I don't know why, but ever since I was a kid, I've never liked doing what everyone else is doing. Like I'm the opposite of most people. Most people find comfort in going with the crowd, where I'm very averse. If I see the crowd doing something, I'll intentionally do the complete opposite, just because I never ever want to be normal. I never want to be just average. And I've always been like that since I was a kid. If I saw people, all my classmates or something doing something, like wearing a certain type of jeans or tennis shoes, I would always do the complete opposite, because I never wanted to be part of the group. I never wanted to be normal. I never wanted to be average. I always wanted to be different. And I always, I don't know why, but that's been kind of a quirk with my personality. It's gotten me into some trouble, especially when I was young. I was definitely, I was in detention a lot more than I was out of detention throughout grade school, junior high, and high school. But I was being suspended and all these things. But it's also served me well from the standpoint of having a natural contrarian view.
Mm-hmm. Have you discovered that going against the grain, kind of swimming upstream against the crowd, against the herd, that comes with a lot of I mean, it takes a lot more effort when you don't have the inertia of a crowd behind you to move into something. Do you find that in any way an obstacle, or do you kind of relish that?
No, because I don't know why it's as an entrepreneur, I think there's a variety of personalities that do well, but one of the personality traits that I've seen that's very consistent with a lot of the successful entrepreneurs that I've had the pleasure of interacting with over my life is, for better or worse, they have an extreme confidence in their own ability to make decisions. Mm-hmm. Sometimes to the point of being overly stubborn and not listening to anyone. But I definitely fall into the category of if I've made a decision, I think that I'm right, and there's no second guessing it. There's no wishy-washy around. I'm very decisive once I've made a decision, and I have the utmost confidence in my own decision-making ability. And so if that goes against the grain, which it typically does, I mean, it sounds bad, but I just, in my own head, I'm thinking, man, everyone's an idiot. And, I'm right, and I'm going to make a ton of money here, and everyone else is just too blind to see it. And they can pound sand. And then it kind of gets reinforced, because then most of the investments that I've made have fallen into that category where everyone tells me I am stupid. So then, not only do you have that level of confidence in your own decisions, but then everyone's telling you stupid, and that's where you've made all the money. So that reinforces that you're right. So I guess the short answer to your question is no, it's never bothered me. And it's just kind of my personality again.
Do you feel that potentially other people don't follow that path because of fear? Yeah. Is fear stopping them from going out there and trusting their gut and doing something and being willing to learn if they make a mistake so they don't do it the second time?
Oh, yeah. It's totally against human nature. You know what's interesting is I used to be good buddies with a very, within his circle, he was a famous guy. He was a psychologist in Washington, D.C. when I had an office out there. We'd go to dinner every once in a while. And I had dinner with him one time, and we were talking about performance, and we were talking about competitive performance. And we were talking about that and evolution. And I stopped and thought about it. I said, you know what? Maybe that's why there's so few people, and I use basketball as an example. There's so few guys, even in the NBA, that can sit there on the free throw line with 1 second to go in the game and being down by a point and sit there and nail both free throws like they've got ice in their veins, like they don't even feel the pressure. And I looked at my doctor buddy and I said, maybe that's because the people that are prone to that have that ice in their veins, that they're just not, they just almost have an irrational ignorance to the danger and to that adrenaline and to that fear, if you will. Maybe they were the ones that when that big dinosaur came up and looked at them in the face, they just stood there and they didn't run away. Mm-hmm. And they got eaten by all the dinosaurs. So there's not much of their genetics that are still around. And he kind of looked up in the air. He's like, yeah, maybe you're right. And so I think it's kind of that same thing that for whatever reason, that what makes a good entrepreneur, and again, I think a lot of this can be learned, but what makes someone just fall into that bucket just straight from birth is maybe a genetic abnormality that for evolution or for whatever reason, just those genetics got wiped out of the pool a long time ago, and they're far and few between. So I guess my point is, I think that the normal person doesn't have that makeup. That's not their default position. So for them, this is going way, I think that's the best way to describe it, is for them, this is way outside their comfort zone. To not have a 9-to-5 consistent gig where you know the money that's coming in, you got your weekends off, you're going to have 2 weeks a year off, you can plan your vacation 2 years in advance. You know, most people, you sit there and ask them what they're going to do next year for their vacation, and they've already planned the hotel and where they're going to go. That is unbelievable. I honestly don't know where I'm going to be tomorrow. Right now I'm in Puerto Rico. I'm supposed to be in Vegas next week. After that, I'm supposed to be in Dubai. Who knows? That could change. I might go back to St. Bart's. I have no idea where I'm going to be. It's totally up in the air. It's much more spontaneous. But my point is, I think that's what most people really gravitate to, because I think it gives them a sense of control, that they're actually in control of a life that when you really get down to the brass tacks, we really have no control over. You know, I could walk across the street today and get hit by a bus. You don't know. We have very little control over our lives. And I think that creates a dissonance, a psychological dissonance, and it creates stress for most people, and they don't like that. So the more control they have, the better, the more plans. So getting outside of that comfort zone for them really is a struggle, when they could just take the path of least resistance. And also, too, they can rationalize it, right? I see this all the time when, you talk about some sort of investment or being an entrepreneur, and they'll give you 100 reasons why they can't do it, and 100 reasons why it's not a good idea, or it's taking on too much risk or whatever. I think they do that because it makes them feel better in their own mind about not taking action. So the next time they're just sitting on the couch on a Sunday watching football, as an example, where in the back of their mind, they're like, you know what? I should really get online and start a side hustle. I should do something, because I'm not going to be able to depend on my 401k, or I'm not going to be able to depend on Social Security. They don't do anything, and they rationalize it by convincing themselves that by doing that would be a mistake. And therefore, I might as well just sit here and not do anything and just stay on the couch. And they take comfort in the fact that all their friends are doing it as well. You know, all my friends are here not doing anything. All my friends are working 9 to 5. So what's my risk when everyone else is doing it? So it goes back to that, maybe that evolutionary process where we just kind of naturally go along with whatever the herd is doing, because there's safety in numbers. And when you've got a big dinosaur that's running after you, that's trying to eat you or whatever, when you can stay with that herd, it's going to mean that you're going to have a lot more, a better chance of actually surviving. And so maybe those people that had that herd mentality were the ones that survived. And maybe that's why 99% of the human population now falls into that category.
I love this analogy with the dinosaurs, because I think it resonates very well, and it leads me towards the question about why so many successful entrepreneurs, yourself included, and many others, seem to have a common theme of being cautious about things that are around them that they do not have control over, because they want to assess risk management, and that's a big part of it. And one of the biggest things, I think, is an area where I know you're passionate about, and that's macro. Talking in terms about the dollar, the Fed, government policy, and so on. And I also have noticed in many of your videos a reference to the fourth turning. How do you put that together? Where's your position in regards to, say, what the world might look like in the next 5 years?
Well, if you look at history, what happens is the gap between the haves and the have-nots, as it increases, there is a push towards social unrest. There's a few things that trigger that. That's one. Number 2 is when you have a subsidy that's taken away from the general public. Number 3 is when people can't afford to put food on the table.
Mm-hmm.
That's where you get quite a bit of social unrest. And unfortunately, the difference between the have and the have-nots isn't necessarily how well the have-nots are doing. It's the delta. So as an example, but based on the psychologists and the guys who really, and gals who study this stuff, and from what I've read and from what I've seen and heard on podcasts and audiobooks and whatnot, there would be less social unrest if, let's say, the quote unquote poor middle class in the United States was making an average income of $30,000, and yet the quote unquote rich, to qualify for that, was, let's say they were at $200,000. If that was the delta, we would have far less social unrest compared to if we had the, let's say, quote unquote poor and middle class. Let's say their average wages or income was $100,000 a year, same rate of inflation, so their purchasing power goes up, triples. But if the quote unquote rich went from, let's say, 200 grand to 10 million, so there's a far bigger spread, you would actually have more, substantially more social unrest, even though the bottom of the income totem pole, if you will, is doing far better. And now this is not to say at all that, you Americans that are making 20, 30 grand a year, you should be happy that you're doing so well. I'm not saying that. That's not what I'm saying at all. I think that that wages have been stagnant when you look at inflation for that group for decades. I think that's wrong. But I think most people lay it on the feet, or lay it at the feet of capitalism, and where if they really kind of studied it and pull back the layers of the onion and understand what's going on, they would realize that isn't a result of capitalism and a free market. That is a result of a tops-down, centralized approach to trying to micromanage the economy, more specifically interest rates and the quantity of money through the Federal Reserve. And they exacerbate this wealth inequality, this gap. And unfortunately, the only tools that they have at their disposal will make it worse. It won't make it better, because the only thing they can do is inflate asset prices. So if they're just inflating asset prices, hoping that as a result that those people who own the assets will spend more money, and that will trickle down to the workers, let's say, it's not going to happen. So so they're just, my point is, as things get worse, they'll just do more of what they've done in the past, which will just make the problem worse. So right. I don't see this getting better. And if you look at the fourth turning, they kind of outline it there, and generally these cycles last about 8 years. So that's why right now, not only is pretty much everything in the United States just wildly overpriced, but I don't think it's somewhere that's going to be friendly to capital over the next 3 to 5 years, especially when you look at what's kind of going on in California, and then notice that's most likely kind of a trend. And I think people that are living in Texas and Nevada and Arizona and Florida, I think you're in a much, much better spot than being in California, that's for sure. But I think that unfortunately those people may be whistling by the graveyard in the standpoint of they think it can't happen in Texas, when I can assure you that it can. And even if it doesn't happen at a state level, it could happen at a federal level. So let's look at what they're doing in California with the wealth tax, where it's craziness. And I get it. It starts at 30 million, so it doesn't affect a lot of people. But that's the way it is now. They put that into effect, and I guarantee it's not going to be 30 million in 3 or 4 years.
Right.
That's going to go down to 3 million. And then if you have inflation go up substantially, then you could have a situation where someone that's quote unquote middle class has assets of $3 million. I mean, that's just a nominal number. It doesn't imply purchasing power. And I don't think people really connect those dots. But that they could have that come out federally. I mean, who knows what's going to come down the pipeline. I've got a good friend on Twitter named Jason Burrick, who I think coined it perfectly. He says the game plan for the central planners, this includes the federal government and the Fed, really needs to be, or is going to be, stagflate, lie, and tax. Because that's their only way out, because they have to create inflation, because that's the way to get people out of a debt problem, because you're paying it back with devalued currency units. And we're going to have most likely stagflation, meaning high unemployment, because of what's happening structurally, or what has happened structurally, and the distortions in our economy going back to 2008. Then on top of that, you have the massive, I think destruction's too light of a word, but just I don't know, we'll go with destruction, but the destruction of the economy due to the virus is creating, just exacerbating the structural unemployment problem that we're going to have for many years. So that's where you get the stagflation. And then they're going to have to try to increase taxes, because I don't think that the paying it back with currency or devalued currency units is going to do enough to decrease the debt burden. And then they're going to have to lie about it, because if they have to run inflation at, let's say, 10%, but they can't increase interest rates like they normally would, for going back to like 1981 as an example with Paul Volcker. So they're going to have to come up with some reason why they're letting inflation running hot, but they're not increasing interest rates. And I think the reason they're going to come up with is just, oh, well, we don't have any inflation. And we're just going to kind of jerry-rig the CPI data more and more and more. I mean, they're already doing it. But they're just going to, and all the people that you're talking about are even going to get more pissed, because they're going to say, screw you. I don't care what you're saying about inflation being low. Every single time I go to the grocery store, I have to pay an extra $20. My rent is going up by $50 every single 6 months. My health insurance is going up. My education costs are going up. Gas prices are going up. So you can sit there, Federal Reserve and Mr. President, all day long and say we've got the greatest economy in human history and there's no inflation, but I'm still going out to the street with my pitchfork. Right. And so I think that's unfortunately the way we go in the United States. Now, to be clear, there are no certainties in life, especially in economics, that's for sure. There are only probabilities. So I think that people need to analyze this situation for themselves and come to their own conclusion as to what the probabilities are of deflation or inflation or stagflation coming down through the pipeline over the next few years.
Well, one thing that's interesting about that, and you're outside, well, you're in Puerto Rico, but spending a lot of time outside of the US, and I've lived in the United States for 25, 30 years, but I still think like an immigrant, and I guess it's because I was raised outside of it. When you look upon it from an outside perspective, looking from the outside into the US, it seems to me that other countries that have banked their entire reserves on the US dollar, 80% of the world, countries that are out there that are using the US dollar as kind of a safe haven way that they can do their inter-country transfers and commerce. We're starting to see, certainly in Australia, a lot of large corporations. I think Rio Tinto recently decided that they were no longer willing to settle all their transactions in US dollars, but they would be willing to accept the Chinese yuan as a currency base for settlement. If that trend continues as more countries look from the outside in at the United States and they see high levels of debt, civil unrest, wealth disparity, kind of a government in turmoil, with these things being seen from the outside, if they start pulling off the US dollar and moving to gold or moving to some digital asset or whatever. How do you think that kind of exasperates the problem in the United States? How does it accelerate the end point here?
Everything I talked about, it makes it worse.
Okay.
Because so what you're talking about is in a nutshell, is less demand for dollars. And so if there's less demand for dollars outside of the United States, then those dollars are, those people that are holding dollars or entities or countries, they're going to want to get rid of those dollars because number one, they don't need as much if they're transacting in some, and again, this doesn't happen overnight. It's a very long, gradual process. But the bottom line is there's less demand. So if there's less demand for those dollars come back to the United States. So if those dollars come back to the United States and start circulating within our domestic economy, what are they going to be doing? They're going to be chasing goods and services. And then it's just the amount of supply you have. You know, if you got 10 times the supply of currency units and the exact same goods and services, then the cost of those goods and services denominated in that currency unit is going to go up. It's just, it's pretty darn simple, unless velocity is really going down, which it most likely wouldn't, because that, I don't want to get into, I don't want to bore you to death in your audience, but that, because that would directly increase bank deposits in the commercial banking system instead of increasing base money that's just held at the Fed, which is pretty much what quantitative easing has done, which is why you've seen asset inflation and you haven't seen as much consumer price inflation since 2008. So basically all those dollars, and people say, well, how many dollars are you talking about? Well, I talked to a lot of experts, and most of them say that there's more dollars outside of the United States than are inside the United States. So if our, let's call it broad money, is what the Fed would admit to is roughly $20 trillion, then you've got to assume there's another $20 trillion outside of the United States. So if it, obviously that we'll take it to an extreme just as a thought experiment. If all those $20 trillion outside the United States came back into the United States tomorrow, let's just say it just somehow happened overnight, then the price of goods and services would go through the roof. The unemployment would be just as high, and the people's, I know there's what they call a pain index, an economic pain or suffering index, something like that. But that's basically how fast the rate of inflation is going up relative to people's incomes. And see, remember, incomes are always a lagging thing with inflation. They typically lag the consumer prices going up. So if you had consumer prices going up just almost vertical in a straight line and people's wages being stagnant, I mean, think about what that would do to people's purchasing power. I mean, it crushes it. So now that what we talked about earlier with the social unrest, if they can't afford to put food on the table, that's going to get a lot worse. And the United States is playing with fire, and they have been for a long time, because we've been running these trade deficits, which and we have to because of Triffin's paradox. And again, I won't bore you to death with that, but basically we have to create more currency units for the world to do business with, or else their economies start to suffer because it constricts them, right? So I don't know that that's the reason we've done these trade deficits. I don't think it's altruistic, but it just happens that we've run these trade deficits. So my point is, if you look at what a trade deficit is, it means that the United States is importing more than they're exporting. So if we are importing a lot more every single year, that by definition, we are consuming more than we produce. So if you get to a point where, let's say we have supply chains that get constricted, or we want to bring everything home to the United States, we want to start making stuff in America, we can't. We don't make enough stuff in the United States in order to consume at the same rate, right? So if we just don't produce enough goods and services. So if we had to live off the goods and services that we produce, the standard of living would decrease substantially. So then if you have the United States dollar getting weaker, that means that the cost of those goods and services that are coming in from those other countries that we rely on so heavily, would have to go up massively in price, right? So imagine going to Walmart next weekend to buy your supplies for the month or whatever, and the prices of everything. And I'm not just talking about the food. I'm talking about the toys. The Walmart goes from being Walmart to Neiman Marcus, right? As far as the price of stuff, but the goods are still the same quality, right? So that's really what we're talking about, and that's how it would affect the everyday person. That's really, a lot of people talk about the Japanification of the United States, and quite frankly, I think that's our best case scenario. If we could somehow get away with just the next 3 decades being just this gradual kind of grind lower with kind of disinflation and a little bit of deflation here, just really a no growth economy. Unfortunately, I think that's the best way out or the path of least resistance for the U.S. if they can pull it off. But I don't think they can, because the United States economy is structurally so different from Japan. First and foremost, that trade deficit. And just for people to get their mind around it, if we're importing more than we're exporting, that means that what we are exporting to get those imports are our currency units, right? So we're basically saying to these people that are producing all this stuff that we're consuming, so we don't have to get off the couch on Sundays, we can sit back and watch that football game, because all those people in China are producing the stuff that we're going to buy at Walmart. We don't have to produce that stuff. And all we have to do is give them these green pieces of paper. And what do? They buy our assets. They buy our treasuries. They buy our real estate. They buy all this stuff with these green pieces of paper. But at a certain point, going back to what you were saying, if they don't want these green pieces of paper anymore, then how are we going to get their stuff?
Right.
We're not. And so then so you have price inflation, you have fewer options, you have the standard of living go down, and basically it just goes back to what every third grader knows. And that's that if you consume more than you produce, at some point in time, you're going to have to do the opposite. You're going to have to produce more than you consume. And we have been consuming more than we produce in the United States since the early 1980s. We've been in a 40-year down cycle in interest rates with the reserve currency, where we've had this privilege, where we've been able to do that. But at some point, we're going to have to go 20, 30 years where we're under consuming, and therefore the standard of living is going to decrease substantially.
Wow, that's interesting. So from an international standpoint, looking at it outside, where do you think the opportunities may lie in terms of, say, countries, regions, that sort of thing?
I think that you have to look at countries where they might not be great right now, but they're doing things, they're going in the right direction. I always like to look at the trajectory. So let's look at an extreme example, okay? And I'm not saying someone should invest here. I'm just using this as a kind of a hypothetical example to show you what I'm talking about with trajectory. Let's look at Saudi Arabia and the United States. So right now, anyone in their right mind would much prefer to invest in the United States than Saudi Arabia, rightfully so. But if you look at the trajectory of the United States with all of these protests, we'll call it, sometimes violent, sometimes they're not violent, but they all have a kind of a consistent theme regardless of why they're protesting. And that theme is a push towards Marxism and socialism, really. And so that's not good for capital, and that's not going to be good for the economy. That's going to be a way to produce less. It's less economic output, which means the standard of living goes down. So regardless of how they want to spin it. Where you have Saudi Arabia, and I haven't really seen too much of this in the news, but I know people in Saudi Arabia that are kind of there and they've worked there for many years, some over a decade. And there's rumblings, they haven't done this obviously, but there's rumblings of them legalizing gambling in their capital city there in order to bring in casinos to be like the Las Vegas of the Middle East and that entire region. Now you say, George, this is impossible. They've got Sharia law. They've got they don't even let women drive, all these things. I get it. I totally get it. And I'm not saying this is happening tomorrow, but all I'm doing is just using that as an example of two countries. One country obviously is way, 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 way better right now, but they're on different trajectories. One country, hopefully, if they continue on this path, they're getting better. Where if you're just looking at it from a standpoint of free market capitalism, the other one is trending the other way. So I would really try to find countries that were trending the right way. And I think that a lot of the countries in the kind of the southeastern Europe area, I know Georgia is a country that I've looked at, Tbilisi, which I think they're just doing some amazing things. An example there that I'd use, just very small example, is you can start a business there in like 20 minutes. You just download the paperwork. And I heard from people that are there that, so I don't have experience of this on my own, but I've heard from the people there that their local government office is literally got a drive-through, like a McDonald's. So you download the paperwork to start your LLC, and then you just go. You don't have to go inside to take a number. You just go to the drive-through and go, there you are, buddy. I don't know if they've got one of those micro, like here, I'll take a cheeseburger. But I'll take one LLC and a S Corp to go or something like that. But you see my point is they're trying to make it as easy as possible for people to start businesses, where in the United States on aggregate total, and I know there's places like Texas and that are welcoming people, and that's fantastic. But if you look at what they're doing at a federal level, it's just the opposite. So that's without giving any specific details or investment advice, that's what I'd encourage people to do.
So look to countries that are embracing capitalistic principles at a government level and demonstrating that per your example, as opposed to countries that seem to be waning from their position on capitalism and moving more towards, say, a socialist government. Is that a reasonable assumption?
That's exactly right. And I even would go so far as to not just use the word capitalism, because I think it has a negative connotation in today's day and age, but I would say free market capital. Right. I think that's the key. We want a free market where people are allowed to fail. Because you say capitalism, and people are like, oh, yeah, well, that's what we got in 2008 where they bailed out the banks. That was great capitalism. Yeah, we want more of that. No. That is the opposite of capitalism. We want free markets. And that just means where people are allowed to be successful, but and entities and huge corporations are allowed to fail, where Schumpeter's creative destruction is encouraged. Where governments see that as a good thing, not a bad thing. And so it's all about private property rights, letting people make decisions on their own, take control of their own lives, where we don't have this intrusive big brother, top-down kind of central planning type of approach. And yes, does that create more risks for the individual? Absolutely it does. It 100% does. Listen, if you don't want any risk, just live in a bubble your whole entire life, protected from everything out there. Let's all just be children and the government be our parents, and just have this maternal type of instinct or relationship with the government and the person. And I guarantee you'll have less risk. But do we want that? We want quality of life. And I think quality of life comes with the ability to get out there and make a go of it ourselves, and to rely on ourselves, take accountability for our own actions, take accountability and be proud of our success, but own up to our failures, learn from them, move forward. And I think that's what we want to strive for. And that's what's encouraged in a system of private property, free market, and capitalism. So again, I just kind of said it in a different way, but to your point, I think that's what people should strive for. And that's where you should look for your capital to go, because you want to go places where your capital is being treated better, not where it's got a target on its back.
And that point of wisdom from George is where we had to end our recording. Unfortunately, the gods of the internet were not shining brightly upon us at that point in time, and George was calling from Puerto Rico. So we had a disconnect, and that's unfortunately all we got. However, I thought having more than an hour worth of content there was more than enough for you to be able to partake of the wisdom of George Gammon. And I hope that you've had a taste of him and his entertaining style, because his YouTube channels are excellent and some of the best videos I've ever seen on YouTube in his tutorials. And I know I'm not alone. He's obviously been praised by the likes of Robert Kiyosaki and many, many others. And so I would absolutely encourage you to subscribe to his channel and find out more about George. You can go to his website, georgegammon.com, georgegammon.com. And consider signing up for his Rebel Capitalist Pro program, which enables you to get access to almost inside level information that George and his team have come up with. And he's got some incredibly smart macroeconomic people there who will tell you what's going on in the world so you can make some sense of it. So again, I wanted a big thanks to George for doing the show with us, and I hope one day we'll get him back on the show again. I hope you've enjoyed it. And at this point, I think we'll leave it there. Again, we'll look forward to seeing you on the next Unconstrained podcast. So bye for now.